So we are going to make a start. As is always the case with people dashing from one meeting to another, I'm sure that we'll have a few people join us in the next few minutes. If you haven't had a chance to yet, please introduce yourself to us all in the chat function below. Just to check that we're all in the right place, this webinar is Preventing Children's Involvement in Violence, What Works in Schools, and it's great to have so many of you join us on the call. We're going to be hearing about both guidance and practice, and we are going to be talking about our recent YEF education practice guidance and what it looks like when we try and implement it in different schools and contexts in the education setting. So in terms of housekeeping, I just wanted to mention that our webinar is going to be recorded. We record all of our webinars because in this digital world, it's always helpful for those who can't attend immediately to be able to access it afterwards. And if you're attending the call right now, you'll also get a link to the recording as well, just in case you want to go back a bit later on and kind of pick up on something that was mentioned or talked about. It's great to see all of you introducing yourselves in the chat and see that we've got such a wide range of experience and a wide range of locations as well, different places from across the country joining us today. So I am going to talk briefly about who our speakers are, and then you'll hear from them in much more detail a bit later on. And we've designed this session to be interactive, so please do use the chat function to ask questions, to make points, and to share your thoughts as we're going through. Rather than leave all the questions to the end and have some of the really great nuggets of information buried, we're going to pause at a few different points. So as questions kind of arise for you, please pop them in the chat. I'll be able to see them there and we'll be able to cover as many as we can in the time that we've got available. So I'm joined with Joe Collin, who's our guidance lead at the YEF, and Dirk Prittard, who is the principal at St Wilfrid's Academy. I'm also joined by Violetta, who's doing all of the important operational things for this webinar, and I'm Dennis Sims, the Head of Change for Education at the YEF. We at the YEF focus on a wide range of different sectors, and education is a particularly important one for us because we know that as educators, we can safeguard children, we can identify and intervene, and we can also provide effective support and education, which is really important and passionate for me, passion area for me. So my background is as a mainstream secondary teacher and leader, and then head of school in alternative provision here in Nottingham. I've worked with such a wide range of multi-academy trusts and schools and education charities, and most recently joined the YEF to help translate all of the great stuff that we're learning through our research and impact evaluations into meaningful policy and practice change. So the format of today is going to be that we're going to first hear from Joe around the recently published YEF education practice guidance. Again, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of that. And then we're going to hear from Dirk around what does it mean in practice and what are some of the things that he and his team have learned along the way. So Joe, I'm going to hand over to you. So you feel free to pop your slides up as I introduce you. So Joe is the Youth Endowments practice lead, as I mentioned. There we go. Thank you. Great, we're seeing that. And Joe leads on the Youth Endowments work at interpreting our findings from evaluations and translating them into actionable insights. In a previous life, he worked at the EEF, and before that, supported students from underrepresented groups to access and thrive at university. And a very, very long time ago, he was a history teacher in Birmingham. So Joe, it's great to have you with us with that range of experience. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dennis. It's like reading my LinkedIn. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. As Dennis introduced me, my name's Joe. I'm the guidance lead here at the YEF. And it's a real pleasure to be sharing our new practice guidance with you this afternoon. And this is all about how schools, colleges and alternative provision can help prevent children's involvement in violence. We're really proud of this work, and we're particularly proud of how involved current school, college and AP leaders, one of whom is Dirk on the call, how involved they've been in the development of this work. But we also know that in order for this to have any value, any impact, practice guidance of this kind has to be implemented. There's absolutely no point that it just sits on our office sits on the shelf in our office. And so it's really fantastic to be speaking to you today and speaking to you about some of the messages within this practice guidance. Worth noting as well, I mean, if you Google YF Education Practice Guidance, it's freely available. You can have a look at it. Very easy to find, and you might want to have a look either during the session or after. But before I get into the guidance and our key recommendations, our key evidence-based recommendations that we set out in it, I just want to start with a bit of explanation of why this guidance is needed. Now, I can see in the chat in terms of the expertise we've got, there's a lot of expertise in the education sector, a lot of expertise in violence reduction. I suspect I'm preaching to the converted with some of this. But some of it is also sort of updated statistics that I suspect will be of great interest. So last year, we surveyed 7,500 13 to 17-year-olds, and a staggering 1 in 6 reported being victims of violence in the preceding 12 months, while 1 in 7 reported committing violence in the same period. Violence impacts children's lives, clearly. We also know that violence has a wider impact on children's education. So in that same survey of 7,500 children, 20% of them, so a fifth of them, said that they'd missed school due to feeling unsafe. It's really staggering. I'll come on to discuss attendance shortly, but we know that absence is a massive issue right now, and that's a really alarming statistic. 18% said they found it harder to concentrate at school due to violence or the fear of violence. So clearly, again, violence is impacting violence, and the perception of violence and the fear of violence is impacting children and their education. And this is unsurprising because we know that violence occurs in schools, colleges, and AP. And we know that because we've asked teachers. So in October, we surveyed over 7,000 teachers, and 67% of them, over 2/3 of them, said that in the past term, a child had committed a violent assault against another child within their school. Nearly half of them said a physical assault had occurred against a teacher. And a really alarming 15% of teachers reported that a child had brought a weapon into school. And that's what teachers know about. So look, one of the things we can certainly say is that violence is a part of children's lives. It impacts children's lives. They're aware of it and they perceive a fear of it. However, simultaneously, it's important for us not to overstate that fear. And particularly in the context of education. And that's because schools, colleges, and AP are really uniquely placed to support children and young people, and they're safe places, particularly relative to other places that children are. So 85% of children feel safe in school. That's fantastic. That's great. And so, yes, it's easy for me to share some of these statistics, but all those statistics around violence and the prevalence of violence shows that, yes, violence is around. We know it's here. But we shouldn't overstate them. So whereas 85% of children feel safe at school, that's compared to 71% who feel safe in shopping centres, 51% on the street, 54% at youth clubs. Schools are safe places for children. 61% of children think that teachers keep them safe. That's more than the 50% that think that the police do. So education settings are still a real force for good in protecting children and keeping them safe. And staff agree too. So in this same survey, we asked staff, how safe do you feel at school? 90% of them said that they felt very safe or safe at school. So the overwhelming majority of staff feel safe at school. So yes, we need some violence. We need some guidance because violence is clearly impinging on the lives of children. But what should that guidance look like? And everything that we do at YF, we're constantly trying to make sure that it's as evidence-informed as possible. Now, the YF, like the EF, who I'm sure many of you, your education colleagues may have come across, we're a government-funded What Works centre. So everything that we do has high-quality evidence at its core. And the same is true of this guidance. So this guidance draws largely from the YF toolkit, which I know many of you will have seen. I'd recommend it if you haven't yet. and that features over 2,000 studies, violence reduction studies from right across the world. We had some really fantastic critical reflection from some current school, college, and AP leaders and some leading academics. A brilliant strategic stakeholder group where we've got fantastic individuals like the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, Martin Oliver, Ofsted Chief Inspector, Owen Evans, the Chief Inspector of Estin, representatives from teaching unions and head teaching unions. And we've also included some additional sources of evidence like the surveys that I've alluded to, and a wide variety of YEF conducted evaluations on different projects. All of that has come together to produce 5 recommendations. And before I share those 5 recommendations, I'm really building the suspense here. But before I share those recommendations, one really critical thing to underline before we get into them, before we start discussing them, is the importance of safeguarding. Now, children's involvement in violence should be seen as a safeguarding issue. And before considering any of the recommendations that I'll come on to discuss, school, college, and AP leaders must always ensure that they're fulfilling that safeguarding role effectively. And the guidance begins by explaining the importance of following the statutory safeguarding guidance in your country, whether that's England or Wales, and ensuring that you have appropriate safeguarding policies and procedures in place, that you're playing your role in multi-agency safeguarding arrangements locally, that your staff are undergoing appropriate safeguarding training. All of that is so critical before we even get into this. And I know that if you're leading an education setting, you don't need me to tell you that, but it's so critical for us to underline that. The other thing we hope you'll notice from these recommendations is that they're not looking to reinvent the wheel, and that's on purpose. We recognise that resource is tight, it's limited, and we're not going to come out and say you need to completely redesign everything that you're doing. Firstly, that's unrealistic. Secondly, it's unnecessary. There's so much fantastic good practice that is already happening, and so many good schools that are delivering large parts of these recommendations. And I'm sure that when you see some of them, you'll think, oh, I know that school, it's doing that really well. Or you might think that school's doing a bit of that well. Maybe we'll think about implementation there. Or that school's not doing that recommendation. Maybe I could speak to them about that. So the 5 recommendations. And as I say, these are all evidence-informed recommendations on how schools, colleges, and alternative provision can help protect children from violence. So recommendation 1, keep children in education. 2, provide children with trusted adults. 3, develop children's social and emotional skills. 4, target efforts at the places and times where violence occurs. And 5, cautiously consider unproven strategies and avoid harmful approaches. And I'm just going to go through each of these in turn, and then we'll have a good 15 minutes after to get into some discussion. So do save the questions as we progress through. So recommendation 1 is really critical, and it aligns with what's probably school, college, and AP leaders, what's probably one of their number 1 priorities right now, and that's to keep children in education. We know that schools, colleges, and AP can and do play a protective role in providing children with trusted adults, a safe place to be, providing that crucial safeguarding function. But in order for all of those functions to happen, children need to be in the setting. They need to be in school. They need to be in college. They need to be in their AP setting. So obviously what's really critical at the moment is the sort of really sharp post-COVID rise in absence and making sure that settings are using evidence-informed strategies to get children back into school. We share some of those in the guidance. So one example that we're really heartened to see that 73% of teachers report their school is doing this is meeting with parents and carers of children who aren't in school, looking to establish why they're not in school and then deliver strategies to get them back in. Another one's breakfast clubs. 39% of teachers we surveyed said that their school is delivering a breakfast club. And again, there is evidence and relatively robust evidence actually in an English context from something called the Magic Breakfast Programme at a primary level, that delivering a breakfast club can get children into school and improve attendance. Aside from attendance, exclusion can also be a challenge here. As we know, exclusion and suspension is associated with later involvement in violence. However, we completely recognise that when deciding whether to suspend or exclude a child, it's a very challenging decision for head teachers to take. It's not a decision that's taken lightly, and head teachers need to balance the needs of individual children and the wider school community. We also acknowledge there's a huge amount of heat in the debate around whether to exclude or not. And actually, from the YF's perspective, we quite strongly think that the focus shouldn't be on that debate. Instead, what it should be on is things we can all agree on. So first and foremost, how can we reduce the need for exclusion by improving behaviour? And so we set out some whole school and some targeted behaviour strategies to support that. But then really critically, how can we provide appropriate support for the temporarily suspended and permanently excluded children who are at greater risk? And the guidance goes into lots of detail on that. And I'll defer to some fantastic colleagues, particularly in the AP sector, and we'll hear from Dirk shortly on some of the support that he's and his setting is providing to children. But how can you make sure that if a child is suspended or excluded, that they are receiving really high quality support? So, first and foremost, following the statutory guidance in your country, and then considering, have you assigned a pastoral professional? Let's say a child's been suspended. Have you got a pastoral professional who's assigned in your school, who's checking in on them every day, giving them a ring, seeing how they're getting on? Are you having regular review meetings with the child and their family to work out, right, when are you going to be integrated back into school? When they do return to school, are you having a meeting with them, a reintegration meeting? Could you provide a mentor for them once they return? And I'll come on to talk about the value of those mentors shortly. And yes, Laura, we can certainly share these slides after. So that's recommendation 1, keep children in education. Recommendation 2 is to provide children with trusted adults. Now, for those of you familiar with YF's work from across a variety of sectors, you'll have seen this before. This is a common message from YF, and it's certainly an evidence-based message. And that's because having meaningful relationships with a trusted adult who understands the child and wants the best for them can protect children from involvement in violence. Now, of course, teachers and other staff members in schools, colleges and AP, they do this on a daily basis. In every interaction you have with a child, you're developing these trusted relationships. But we also know that vulnerable children may require some additional support, and that additional support can take a variety of forms, particularly depending on what that child's particular interests or needs are. 2 especially promising approaches are mentoring and sports. And both of these are evidence-based solutions that have been shown to reduce children's risk of involvement in violence and offending. So in terms of mentoring, let's say you have a concern about a child. Perhaps they have been suspended on a number of occasions this year. Maybe they're constantly getting into conflict with their peers. Maybe they've been in trouble with the police, or some other identified issue that you think a trusted adult could support them. Recruiting either from internally or externally to your setting, depending on the resource you have available, a trained adult mentor who sits down with them once a week, ideally for up to 2 full terms, and just delivers an hour mentoring session once a week, where they set some targets in relation to their behaviour, in relation to their schoolwork, and check in on those targets as they progress through those 2 terms. Can be a really impactful strategy. Of course, ensure those mentors have appropriate training and supervision, and where you can, seek to minimise the impact of any missed learning from lessons. So perhaps don't have the mentoring session at the same time every week, so the child isn't always missing the same lesson. This has been shown to be really impactful across the evidence. And there are various ways in which you can do it. So sports is another way, and many of you will have seen the sports strand on the YF toolkit. And it's the same principle, right? Could you deliver a coach-led weekly sports session? Could be universal to all children, but just make sure that those vulnerable children that you think could really benefit from that trusted relationship are there and in those sessions. That, weekly, last for a couple of terms. And then make sure you're recruiting those coaches, activity leaders who have this appropriate soft skills to develop those good relationships with children and young people. And that really is a best bet to protect children from involvement in violence. Recommendation 3 is a big one. There's a lot in it, but nonetheless, it's an important one. And that's to develop children's social and emotional skills. Now, a really fascinating statistic from our survey of children, I say we surveyed 7,513 to 17-year-olds last year. 7 out of 10 of those children who admitted perpetrating violence said that they did so because they were provoked. So that's 7 out of 10 of children who admit to perpetrating violence said they did so because they were provoked. Clearly, those children could do with a bit more support on their social and emotional skills, could do with support on, how to think before you act, how to understand someone else's perspective, how to manage aggression once you've been provoked. And there are a variety of ways that schools, colleges, and alternative provision can look to support this. Most obviously, we set out in the guidance what these 5 social and emotional skills are. So they're self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, responsible decision-making, and social awareness. We set those out in the guidance and what we mean by those. And at a curriculum level, you can embed those as part of a universal curriculum. What you can also do is identify some of those children that need some additional support and provide some one-to-one or group sessions where you teach and practice these skills. And we've got a fantastic case study in the guidance from an organisation called the Mental Health Foundation, and they deliver an intervention called Becoming a Man, which does this over the course of 2 years. Many of you may have seen this intervention before. So yeah, first and foremost, can you deliver either by universal or targeted methods social skills teaching? The second really prominent and critical part of this recommendation is social skills around interpersonal skills and interpersonal relationships, and particularly delivering explicit relationship violence reduction sessions, actually delivering sessions on relationship violence reduction that you could do as part of your PSHE sessions in schools, colleges, and AP. We only recommend doing this at secondary level. There is some of this that comes into the curriculum at primary level, but in terms of these specific sessions, delivering these at secondary level, I'd recommend having a look at Ofsted's review of sexual abuse and harassment in schools and colleges that they published in 2021. It's a really harrowing read just for how commonplace sexual assault and sexual harassment is within schools. And consequently, the DfE and also there's plenty of Welsh guidance recently on this as well, have put lots of guidance on what schools can do to try and reduce relationship violence within schools, but also more broadly in society. And really simply delivering some sessions can be a really great starting place on this. A crucial implementation point here is to try and only recruit session leaders who are volunteering into this. Don't just choose the random math teacher. Nothing against math teachers at all, but don't just choose a random math teacher and say, you're delivering relationship violence sessions next week. They're tough sessions to deliver. So is there someone internally in your setting that steps forward and says, yeah, actually, I could do this. Could you provide them with some training? Or is there an external organisation that you've got the resource to bring in? Make sure you can then reinforce the messages from those sessions across the whole settings, whether that's in your behaviour policy or whole school or AP or college assemblies. The final quick point I'll make on social emotional skills is therapy also plays a role here. And we were sort of in two minds about whether to include this in some guidance focused on education. We're really cognizant of the fact that a lot of schools face really severe delays locally on the availability of local mental health services for young people. But what we again recommend is that, where you've identified a child who is in need of some further support, refer them to your local children and young people mental health service. If timely therapy is not available, there are other things you could consider. So there are lots of examples of schools partnering with local charitable or third sector organisations. There are some schools and settings and AP settings, I know Dirk's one of them, who are employing their own mental health specialists and therapists. You might not have the resource to do that. Maybe you could pull together resources from some schools in your local area. And finally, make use of mental health support teams in schools if you have them. There's also in-reach CAMS in Wales, which is a similar service. Recommendation 4 It's all about targeting your efforts. Targeting your efforts at the places and times where violence first occurs. Now, VRU colleagues on the call will be really familiar with this, right? Violence is much more likely to occur between young people between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m., for example. So target your efforts at that. But it's also just really critical in this area to talk to young people, talk to children, talk to staff, teaching staff and other staff in your setting, and just get a sense of where is violence happening? Where do children feel safe? When in the day do they feel safe or less safe? If they come back and say, actually, there's lots of violence that happens at lunchtime. Okay, great. Could you set up a sports program that covers that period at lunchtime? Maybe they say that there's an issue after school. A project YF had been funding with the West Mids Violence Reduction Partnership is a program called Step Together, where chaperones man the routes to and from school to protect children in those areas. So just really making sure you're understanding your local area, you're understanding the needs of children and targeting efforts at those needs. And the final one, so whereas 1 to 4 is about what you should do, 5 is about what you might want to stop doing. And this is all about cautiously considering unproven strategies and avoiding harmful approaches. As I said right at the outset, resource is really stretched and it's best spent on those strategies that have the strongest evidence supporting them. And so we'd really recommend cautiously considering 3 things and not doing a 4th thing. So in terms of the 3 things to cautiously consider, knife crime education programs is one of them. 47% of secondary teachers report to us that their school delivers a knife crime education program, which tend to be knife crime awareness stuff. Tend to be one-off sessions in schools that will talk about the damage knives can do, the prevalence of knives. Advocates of it would argue that it raises the profile on it and teaches children the consequences of it. Critics might argue that raising awareness scares children, and they think, actually, if everyone else is carrying a knife, maybe I need to. The truth is, we don't have any robust evidence either way. And in that context, we'd really question whether resource should be spent on it. And there are probably other things like mentoring or sports or social skills training where it's better to spend your resource. Trauma-informed practice training in particular is another challenging area for us when it comes to the evidence. Trauma matters, and the science on that is pretty clear. Adverse childhood experiences have a long-term relationship with involvement in violence. We're clear on that. What we're not so clear on is what schools can do in response, and in particular, whether schools should train teachers on trauma-informed practice. There's lots of that practice that happens. I think it's about a third of teachers report to us that they've done some of that training. We're not sure if it works. So again, that's not us saying it does or doesn't work. It's just while the evidence is not there, it might make sense to direct efforts elsewhere. And similarly on police in schools, there are lots of reasons to have a police officer in school. There's no evidence yet that it has an impact on violence reduction. The thing to definitely avoid is prison awareness programs. So under no circumstances should children be taken into prisons and shown this is where you're going to end up if you keep going this way, or bringing former prisoners into school to say this is what prison's like, it's terrible, don't get involved in violence. Interventions that have been proven to have a harmful impact. So those are our 5 recommendations. Really keen to hear any reflections and questions you've got on these recommendations. Dennis, shall I hand back to you to sort of facilitate that discussion? And I'll stop sharing.
Great. There's already been some activity in the chat, and please keep those questions coming in. Just to filibuster slightly and give you a little bit more time to come up with a question or type it into the chat. Joe, I wondered if you could kind of share a bit around disproportionality, particularly in relation to pupils from racially minoritized communities and what you found with the research there.
Yeah, of course. And this is, again, anyone that's been to any sort of YF session on this, you'll know that we're really acutely aware of the racial disproportionality, particularly in the youth justice system. And so in all of our work, we're constantly weighing up how might this sector contribute to that, and what could we be doing in education or health or justice to try and further race equity. And we've considered that across the recommendations. So just as one example, in that keep children in education, We know that children from particular ethnic groups, so Gypsy and Roma traveller children, children from an Irish traveller heritage, Black Caribbean children, Black Caribbean and white mixed children are more likely to be excluded or suspended from school. And so we'd hope that a lot of the recommendations that we're setting out within that recommendation should benefit those children. But also there's a really great case study that we liaised with Mission 44 on, and they've funded the Co-op Academy in Leeds and Oasis Community Learning Trust to deliver a program specifically targeted at reducing exclusion and absence amongst racially minoritized communities. And what they do is some of the evidence-informed practice that I've already spoken about. It's a parents' engagement campaign to work out why might children be absent and how can we get them back into school, and a social and emotional skills program to work with children who may be exhibiting behavioural difficulties to try and make sure they can stay in school. So I'd really recommend having a look at that. That's in recommendation 1.
Thanks, Joe. You just mentioned attendance, and there's a question here from Sophie, which is around, do you have data such as like increased attendance and reduction in suspensions that support the recommendations around reducing children's involvement in violence?
Yeah, it's a good question. So our so we know that the interventions that we're setting out can have an impact on reducing attendance. The evidence around attendance is really limited. EEF in 2021 produced a rapid evidence assessment on attendance. There are 72 studies in it. 68 of them are from the US, and the evidence isn't fantastic, but it's the best of what we've got, and so we're using those evidence-informed interventions to suggest some of those strategies. And some of those strategies have evidence and impact on attendance. I think the best example of a program here that I've indicated is the Magic Breakfast program, and that breakfast clubs can improve attendance, and they've been shown to do that in primary schools.
I think that's a really important point, particularly when at the YEF we're specifically focusing on the reduction of children's involvement in violence. And we know that in education that there's lots more other aims and objectives. So where there's something like the breakfast clubs, for example, which can improve attendance and reduce children's involvement in violence, then that sounds like a win-win. Dirk, I want to bring you in.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I was just wanting to pick up on that point, which I'll cover some of it in a moment when I've got an opportunity to go through some of the things that we do at St Wilfrid's. But just on that attendance data over the last 2 years, so I've been head for 5 years at St Wilfrid's. Over the last 2 years, we've got 125 place or AP free school, and our attendance, if you look at the students that have come through the academy over those 2 years, they've gained on average 35% attendance gains from the previous educational settings that they were at before they came to us. And that's an average. So some are clearly far, far higher than that. But that's by implementing some of the strategies that Joe's talked about as well. So I'm happy to share that wider data in relation to attendance. And as an AP free school, our average attendance is much higher than the national average for AP and PRU would be. But the key bit for me is the gains that those young people have made. They want to be in school because of the support and guidance that they're receiving.
Rudy, we've got a question from you. I wonder if you might be open just to taking yourself off mute and posing your question to Joe, if you're able to.
Hi, yeah, no problem. My first question was about your point on behaviour support to reduce the need for school exclusion. I imagine that's a huge area where behaviour support could be taken in so many different ways. And I'm wondering, just in the evidence basis behind this, I've had a brief look at the report that was produced in May. Some of the evidence basis of, the more punitive action or supportive action. And punitive means things like isolation and away from studies. And you have mentioned about trying to keep students involved in lessons as much as possible, and I hear that. Or, for example, is there any evidence base on behaviour policies and the effect of behaviour policies as well?
It's a really fantastic question. So just on the first part of that, in terms of what we're drawing on, then I'll come on to the behaviour policies point. So what we recommend is very much drawn from the EEF's behaviour guidance, and they did a systematic review of all of the evidence relating to behaviour, and set out some really fantastic guidance. And we've sort of condensed it in our report to really focus on universal support and targeted support. So universal support, are you delivering effective classroom management strategies, classroom behaviour management strategies, using reward systems? And then do you have a clearly articulated and consistently implemented school behaviour policy that's well defined and promoted and implemented right across the setting? And schools and heads will know what that is for them, and we'll have particular approaches to doing that. There's also then some targeted support suggestions. So whether that's there is evidence for particular strategies such as daily report cards, having children complete report cards after lessons or after each day, and commenting on whether particular behaviour targets have been met. There's also then a wider sort of sense within targeted support of trying to ensure that schools are maintaining that sense of professional curiosity about what might be causing challenging behaviour amongst young people. Linked to that, providing SEND support where required. Now, of course, I mean, really legitimately, a lot of heads would say, yeah, we totally agree. We don't have the resource, and that's something we're really aware of. But where possible, providing that SEND support where it's required. And considering additional assessments where you think actually this child is really in need, and a multi-agency assessment that goes beyond just their educational needs might be worthwhile. On the policies point, there's no evidence on whether sort of a flat on the grass policy or a more sort of a policy that focuses a bit more on unmet need works better. What we are doing at the moment is we're co-funding quite a large evaluation with the Education Endowment Foundation to answer that question, to look at, are more authoritarian school policies, school behaviour policies, are they associated with better outcomes on attendance and exclusion rates? And I believe they'll also then look at violence. So watch this space. I hope that will be publishing in spring, autumn 2025. But yeah, we certainly acknowledge there's a gap there currently and are trying to fill it.
Great, thanks, Joe. This question has popped up, or questions like it have popped up in the chat, and it's the really, really important question of how do we pay for this stuff? So it's great saying have mentors for children who are vulnerable and offer sports clubs, but in a context of limited funding, what are your thoughts on how some of this can be funded?
It's a really fantastic question, and I'd answer it in two parts. The first is I think thinking really carefully about that fifth recommendation. And is there anything you might currently be spending money on which isn't as evidence-based as something else, and then potentially reprioritizing some of that money? The second is we're really aware that this practice guidance only answers half of the challenge. Actually, maybe slightly less. And so what we're producing in addition to this at the moment is some systems-focused guidance. So whereas the practice-focused guidance is targeted at school, college and AP leaders to say, this is best practice, this is what works. Our systems guidance, which will be published in March 25, is focused on policymakers. And we'll say to them, this is what works. How can you make sure that this happens? How can you give the resource to school, college and AP leaders to help them to deliver this? It's something we're really cognizant of right the way throughout it. We do try and reflect this in the language, but really aware throughout that a really legitimate response to, provide mentors to schools is, yeah, good one. Where am I getting the money for that? And we agree. And we're certainly going to be putting in lots of resource to develop that systems guidance over the next year. I suppose one final point of optimism that I will make is that we were really heartened actually that a lot of schools who responded to our survey are finding ways currently to deliver some of this practice. So half of secondary schools, I believe it is, no, I think it's half all teachers actually. I think it's higher in secondary schools, but half all teachers report that their school is delivering mentoring currently in some form, which is fantastic. So thinking about how you might do that, whether that's pooling resource together locally to try and provide that, using volunteers and third sector organisations where they might be available. A really great case study example that we've got in the guidance is the Rugby Football League, and they're providing a sports and mentoring programme to children. reach out to your local sports club, and your local football club, your local rugby club, see what provision they might have, because a lot of them do have some provision. It's just about directing them towards the particular needs of your vulnerable children. But really fair question.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's always the one, isn't it? With teachers can do that, or schools can do that, and we need to put more into education in order to actually fund and enable that work to take place. There was a question around the prison awareness area, and whether the research mainly focused around prison visits versus being in school and talking about prison and prison involvement. You've got any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, it's I think the vast majority of the research is prison visits, is visits to prison, not prisoners coming into schools. Now, our worry would be how similar the mechanisms might still be. Essentially, anything where you're looking to scare children and say, oh, this is terrible, you're going to end up here, we'd be really uncomfortable with. But of course, like, we recognise that things aren't always that clear cut. So, there might be a knife crime education programme, for example, that has quite a strong emphasis on social skills training, in which case we might say, oh, actually, we're quite interested in that social skills training element. Let's lean into that bit. Or that has a strong emphasis on mentoring in sports. But yeah, it's more towards the evidence of harm is more on actual visits. And many of you will be aware of the Scared Straight program from the United States, where a lot of this evidence base of harm surrounds.
Great, and I did promise to squeeze in as many questions as I could, Joe. So we're gonna get our money's worth from you on this free webinar. Is there any tools that we can be recommended or think about when seeking to evaluate the impact of mentoring or any of these other interventions when we seek to employ them in contexts?
It's a really good question. So I think in terms of evaluating, if you're an individual school, what I wouldn't recommend doing is trying to do a causal evaluation, is trying to do your own RCT. Like, you just don't have the numbers, and I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, what I'd really recommend is two things. The first is just being really clear on what your theory of change is. And what I mean by that is, like, a lot of you will be familiar with theories of change. Sorry if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs here. But being really clear with what your theory of change is. So what is the intervention that you're delivering, and what are the intermediate outcomes you're trying to move, and the final outcome that you're trying to move? So let's say you want to deliver mentoring to children who've been exhibiting behavioural difficulties, and you identify 5 kids and you say, right, I'm going to deliver this to them. So that's number one, identify what the theory of change is, particularly those intermediate outcomes. So the long-term outcome is less risk of involvement in violence. An intermediate outcome might be they're kicked out of less and less, right? Then monitor that intermediate outcome throughout the year, and do that via talking to those young people, talking to the deliverers, monitoring the data in your school. A resource I'd really recommend is the EEF's implementation guidance. I think they've just published an update to it. And that has some really useful resources on how to implement and monitor the implementation of programs within schools specifically. So yeah, I'd recommend having a look at that.
Thank you. I'm just noticing that there are a few more questions in the chat, which we will try our very best to come back to. But Dirk, I'm going to hand over to you in just a moment. It seems like you've already been exchanging your email address and making contacts with people in the group already. So it sounds like people are really excited to hear what you're going to be sharing with us. Just by way of introduction, as I mentioned earlier on, Dirk is principal at St Wilfrid's Academy in Doncaster, and they're a 125 place alternative provision, and they do a range of things from Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 assessments to short-term intervention placements, as well as longer-term programmes for Key Stage 4 pupils. They are doing lots of work around multi-agency approaches, and I'm sure Dirk will talk to you a little bit more about that and how they encourage a bit of creativity and thinking outside the box in relation to supporting children with high needs. Their school have got a really strong record of reintegrating children back into mainstream school, and they're working with lots of local authorities to take the model that they use and employ it in their area. And really pleased to say that you were recently awarded a national award for your recognition around outstanding inclusive practice. So it's such a privilege to have you with us, and I'm going to hand over to you to tell us all about what you've done and what you've learned.
Wow, thank you, Dennis, for that introduction. I hope I can live up to just a small proportion of it. Joe's also a quite hard act to follow, but I've followed some of the questions in the chat with interest. So I'll try and adjust what I was going to say a little bit to try and pick up some of those really pertinent and valuable points. So yeah, as Dennis says, I'm currently principal of St Wilfrid's Academy in Doncaster, part of the Delta Multi Academies Trust. We are 125 place AP free school, and we have a sister school in Leeds that we also work alongside. I'd absolutely 100% back up one of the comments, or several of the comments that were made about the systems that you put in place being so important, the systems and structures that you implement within your school to ensure that there's a really solid framework, including the relational policy, which I'll pick up in a moment a little bit about what we've done at St Wilfrid's and how we have developed a well-being rather than a punitive style of supporting young people in a trauma-informed way. So just looking back at absolutely. The context of our setting is 125 places. At any point during the year, we could have up to 150, 160, but very much so Key Stage 2 and 3. We work on a shorter turnaround, attempting to get young people back into mainstream education or into a more appropriate destination. We've got a really strong working relationship with the local authority, as well as multi-agencies that I'll talk about in a little while. And that's really the key, building those relationships and looking at what we can do. If you read the guidance, there's some of them that are given if you're running a highly effective school, or you just strive to the trusted safe space of schools and those specialist safeguarding teams. They're part and parcel of just what schools do, and the good ones have got that in spades. So the part that we felt we needed really to work on was, if you take that evidence-based support in its context of the YEF report, and you look at, okay, we have these things in our schools, but what is it that we need to put in place to be more effective, to reach out to more young people, to protect them better, to start to have a bigger impact than we currently do? You start to arrive at some of the things that you need to put in place to not take work off people, but to add capacity to the team you've got. And that's really key. And adding capacity to what you currently do, pick up on your strengths, but also how do you share that information amongst professionals to make sure that it follows the child, and the child or the family get as much support as they need. I've only got one slide that I really want to share, but it's fundamental about what we've set up. And hopefully it's going to pick up the right one. So the slide I'm sharing at the moment is really based on the AP Specialist Task Force pilot. So in June 2021, we were approached by the DFE along with 21 other school settings, asking if we could put together a task force of specialists to support young people that were at danger of being involved in violence or exclusion. And so we did so. We looked at various different roles that existed within our local authority, and also some of the roles that we already had within our school setting. So we looked at what we could do to add capacity, looked at the areas that we didn't currently have, and the areas that we invested in were seconding in a youth offending worker, who looking at the family support that we could offer. Currently, we had a system in Doncaster where you'd have to make an early help referral, which could take 6 to 8 weeks before a young person or family was seen. Youth workers, we had a really strong system within the academy for if you like, non-teaching heads of year. That sort of system was in the school and really strong. We looked at the careers advice, because a lot of the work we do is about the destinations. And then we also looked at what we could do to further support speech and language, because that reading and literacy is such an important part of young people's development. So we looked at what we needed to do to put together the team. Initially, it was funded through the DfE, and we put together a strong task force working out the school with seconded colleagues from the local authority. I'll just come out of that. From the local authority. But then very quickly, we realised this was having such a great impact that we needed to do something to sustain it. And the only way that you can really sustain it is by proving that it's effective, and it's reaching the young people and the families that it's intended to do. And we're currently in a position where the funding's about to end for that pilot, and already the local authority in Doncaster has committed to continuing to support us with those specialists. But also we're working alongside a number of local authorities that, having seen that task force in action with the data to back it up, which I'm happy to share, has led to those local authorities saying this is just something that we've got to place, because actually all of these specialists and all of these experts in their areas, these multi-agencies, they exist already. And so what we've been able to show is by co-locating them out of one academy or one school, they've become more effective. And I'll use an example of CAMS, heavily over subscribed within Doncaster. It's really hard to get an appointment. However, the service, although it's oversubscribed, for specialists from CAMS or Educational Psychology Service, I use that example as well, working out of a central location, when appointments are made, often they're missed. So those expensive specialist resources only 50% utilised, because they just were not seeing the number of clients that they were intended to or they needed to. But co-locating them out of the school, instead of having a caseload of 3 during a day because 3 didn't turn up, they're turning into 6 out of 6, and they're becoming more effective, and they're seeing more young people and families. Referrals through early help, because the team are based out of the school and participate in spotlight meetings with the rest of our academic staff. Young people's needs are highlighted quicker, and we can have an early help referral in place and a family worker out with a family within days, if not hours, rather than weeks and months. So that consequently means that we're having work start quicker with those families, something that we weren't expecting, but we've seen as well. Often when lead family practitioner goes out to the home to start work on a young person that is struggling to access the support, academic support in school, they're seeing siblings that perhaps are not on school radar yet, perhaps they're not rearing their head within school as an issue, and that work is starting much earlier. So those early interventions, while it's still early for us to see, those early interventions and that support that the families are receiving is happening quicker and filtering down into primary age pupils, if not sooner. So what we're beginning to see is that further down the system, if you can stop these young people coming out to the more expensive support and that's in the continuum, we're able to have an impact earlier. I've got data to back that up. So if we jump back to 2021-22, we worked with 96 young people in Key Stage 2 and 3 on short turnaround places, looking at assessing need, looking at strategies to help them re-engage with learning. But they were only with us for up to a term before reintegrating back into a school. And so those 96 students, 82% of them haven't come back out of the mainstream setting in the year and a quarter following. So that's quite a high number of young people that have been supported by that wraparound team. And again, reducing the strain on the system further down, perhaps reducing the strain on AP, on PRU, on issues within the mainstream school, but actually in a really supportive way, where mainstream schools are coming to us and saying, we've done everything that we can within our setting, we feel, but we've still not got to the root cause of the trauma that's behind the behaviour that we're seeing in school. What can you do in your setting with your specialist and your expertise around it? And that's very much our sort of philosophy. What can we add to a mainstream school, given the highest quality academic support, but also that wraparound? And it really is that multi-agency approach to early intervention. So I mentioned early help, we've got youth justice worker, and that's a really interesting one. So our seconded youth justice worker used to have 95% of his workload come through cases that were referred through the courts. So that's post shoplifting or post something more serious or post a violence, and then they'd start work with the young person. But what we're seeing now is, because of the young people that he is now working with in a school setting, his caseload's doubled, yet 95% of his caseload is pre-court. So we are seeing signs of a young person's offending or possible offending behaviours and putting those intervention strategies in earlier. So it's dropping back the severity, looking at working with more young people. Counselling, absolutely, 100% want to pick that up. So, and again, what Joe was saying, one of the strong areas is within the sports field. So we've got counselling team that come out from Club Doncaster Foundation. So they're funded by the Premier League, and they've got the Premier League have given them quite a wide remit now. And these are counsellors that are coming from a community aspect to work with our young people. They're not teachers, they're not seen as my staff. A lot of the young people see them as cool and have built a relationship, and there is definitely I feel an underutilized and under tapped resource out there if you go looking for it. And again, what we are seeing by and the lessons that we learnt are, build your capacity, but use the contacts that you have. So I'd be surprised if some colleagues weren't saying, yeah, well, that's all right for you. You've been funded in a pilot. What are you going to do when that money runs out? But actually, if you speak to the colleagues in your school, I've brought in the educational psychologist who's a contact from Esenco, a contact I didn't have, but that Ed Psych now comes in once a fortnight, spends a day in the school and works through a caseload and adds capacity to that multi-agency team. Within Doncaster, all of the NHS, Youth Justice, Early Help Team, they share information on a system called Mosaic. So what we're seeing more and more of is that a young person is struggling through some sort of trauma, they're kicking out with some sort of behaviour, and part of the team is looking at what is the root behind it, but then sharing that information through that NHS, if you like, led information system, and we're able to pick that up with the right people, safeguarded in school, but also pass that information and create a wider team wrapping around the child, but one we've never had to that extent before. I've only just got used to phone calls on Friday night when I think I've stopped working. My family practitioner is out on the street still working with families, giving support and feeding back some real success stories. So for the leadership within in the school team, it's become a bigger beast, but the opportunity to support young people is better than it's ever been. And once that message gets out there about how the multi-agency aspect is really supportive and is really working, more come, because it's just a more effective way of working. So I saw in the chat, that phrase from Field of Dreams, tell them and they will come. That does in some ways stem from, if you can prove it works and have success and take some risk in that way, calculated risk, you will encourage others in, because a lot of the services, they want to be more effective. And the the anecdotal feedback from the teams that come in is that it's better for them than, and they've got access to more support than they've ever had. There was another question on how do we encourage some of the more challenging young people into attending school and buying into some of this support. I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the things we do. Yep, we're still a school. We've got really high academic aspirations. Our bar is right up there. Every year we have some young people, 8s and 9s at their GCSEs. Some years we have some young people achieving their functional skills. It depends on their abilities and where they currently are, and on their learning journey. But it's that wraparound support. It's the destination that we're looking at. But the enrichment side and the well-being side is 100% just as important as that academic side. We set that level of challenge, but we do things such as we have a coach-led basketball session for the Key Stage 2 and 3 students, which actually costs me about £35 a week. But you get that trusted mentor, that trusted adult, and there's, that 6'8" Canadian coming in to play basketball with the young people is worth its weight in gold. And it's that extra thing as well. It's about those conversations that are happening. Every Wednesday afternoon, we've got a traditional sort of, right, Wednesday afternoons, that's your enrichment time, and we sort of break our school down vertically and do some things that are a little bit more out there. So we got a trailer of 30 mountain bikes, which will head off to Clumber Park for the young people to go biking out in the green. And that's midweek, but that's not midweek by accident. That's midweek because that's a break through the middle of the week with the learning, but actually gives them that middle of the week hurdle, encourages attendance, but also it's about those green spaces and continuing that relational support with the people that they're going to do the enrichment with. We have all sorts of things with that. I'm just looking down my list. There's a spray painting club that have been decorating some of the fences in a really, really great graphical way around the school. But that's a youth justice worker who is also a spray paint artist. So you can imagine some of the support and the conversations and the relationship building that are going on in that way, not in a punitive way, but in a way that I'm going to talk to you about doing things right. So that's kind of the sort of things that we've been put in place. And within the guidance, you'll see that we've got a case study in there about therapy. So we've got, which is perhaps my one really expensive resource that we've got within our staffing budget. So we've got an external therapist who is supervised by a high quality third party agency. Is capable of delivering CBT and those longer term therapeutic programs, as well as giving some one-to-one advice and support within the school. And I talked about destinations and being able to move children on, but that sort of work can continue if they were to reintegrate back into a mainstream. That doesn't mean we necessarily need to remove the therapist and the counsellor. That can continue in the next destination that we're in. But we feel that forms a really important part of that support and guidance. And at the end of the day, we felt young people have to have a reason to be where they are. It's got to be more attractive to them than the other less desirable options. So why are the young people coming into school? Why are the young people rather than absconding and having 20, 30, 40% attendance? Why is their attendance 80 to 90%? Why are they wanting to come into school at all when, they didn't used to? And I think the answer is because of the relationships that we've built. And really importantly, there isn't one person in school that has the perfect relationship with any child. It's building that team up where everybody speaks to the young people in a respectful way, but actually shouldn't be afraid, if they're not the answer, to pass on to that next adult. And between us, sometimes it takes 3 or 4 young adults to be able to hit the button on that child and be able to support them in the right way. I could debate the relational policy and the punitive versus reward methods or ideas all day. I won't, but I will tell you what we've decided to do, and we have done for the last 3 years. We don't have detentions. We do very, very rarely suspend or exclude students for extreme behaviours. But what we try to do, rather than that, is we try and give them a way to teach them how to better react and respond to things, because at the end of the day, we've only got them for a short amount of time. So surely it's better to stop that young person punching walls or punching another student and give them a way out that's more successful. So I just tell you what we do. So when learning breaks down in the classroom, and it does, and a young person is not in the right place in a classroom, we've got a wellbeing corridor, which support is called for. That young person knows where the wellbeing space is. It is a comfortable place, as in furniture. It's not a booth room. It doesn't have worksheets in it. It doesn't have. It has books. It doesn't have manuals that you have to read, instructions to follow. What it does have is a highly effective and well-trained counsellor. And that has something far harder than writing lines or completing a worksheet. It has a counsellor that's really effective at getting to the bottom of the reason that young person's in there. And it might be that they didn't sleep the night before, but actually, what's the problem behind it? It might be that they can't read, or their literacy level is so low that they threw the book across the room because they're embarrassed to read out loud. It could be a whole raft of things. So what happens in that room is they're kept in that room and reset. And that could be anything from 5 minutes to a maximum. Our lessons are 45 minutes to a maximum of half an hour or so. But then they're back in lessons and learning reset. And that works for 99% of the time. But the next bit is the most important part. It's what you do with that information. It's about passing on what sits behind that trauma or that behavior or that issue, and passing on to the right people that are then able to put in effective what's the word I'm looking for? Intervention, effective intervention. And that intervention is then tracked, followed, monitored. And that if that young person comes back in again, we'd be looking at the reasons for coming back in and putting a bespoke timetable in place. It's not about excluding them from information, education, about including them and looking at what that next step is. And then by the end of that cycle, what you actually get is that self-fulfilling prophecy, that is, something goes wrong, you come out of that situation, but actually you then talk it through, you get to the bottom of what it is, and then actually the thing you can't do, you're helped with. And if you can help that young person, then you eventually get to an adult that is in society, that has the tools to be able to do the right things. And I sit here and I say, this isn't easy. You know, this isn't easy. And some days I can drive into work and I get nothing done that I've planned to do, because I spent the day talking to young people about what they perceive as going wrong in their lives, what their strengths actually are, and how amazing they are at some things that I can't even do. But surely that's about winning a journey. That's about what we're here for. So, you know, it's a really interesting job. And what I'd say is there's lots in that guidance. And if you can steer clear of absolutely the scare stories and focus on what you can do to have a big impact and what you can do as a young person to improve. And, you know, so things like in our cookery lessons that we have on a weekend through, well, they're about preparing healthy small sized portions for your family. So actually we're looking at gearing them up with some real skills, not baking cakes, by the way, not that we do occasionally do that, but it's about looking at those life skills, but still with a really high academic bar, and say, look, if you can do it, let's get you up there, but we need to build up resilience and those other skills. We need to give you those opportunities. And finally, I think the message I'll leave you, if you get it right, and you can manage to put that support in, you can do some amazing things for and with your young people. But now we're in our 7th year of looking at our NEETs, and each year out of 125 students, we have approximately 50 young long-term year 11s that sit their GCSEs with us in the summer. We're into our 7th year now of having NEETs of 4% or less. So those young people move into continued education, training, or employment. And that's because the team work really hard on the skills and the relationship and helping them get to that point where they can self-regulate. And I think that's the biggest thing we learn, and not to repeat the same things that have happened with and to those young people before they come into your setting, doing things different.
Thank you very much, Dirk. You'll be able to see from the comments that the word refreshing has been used so many times, and you make me almost want to hang my hat up and go back into leading a school. So maybe we should put you on an advert for education leadership. Thank you for sharing all of that. We've got some questions to whiz through. You mentioned co-location of services. Can you talk a little bit, just briefly, around the costs of some of that, or maybe the cost saving in the long term?
Yeah, so what we did is we quite a large. I'm laughing because there's still some people that didn't see it coming, but we're part of a big multi academy trust, and one of our sister schools had quite a new but fairly unused prefabricated, really nice, almost new building on its site, and we pinched it and had it moved to the side of St Wilfrid's. So the team are co-located out of that. So it shares a car park, but it does mean that outside of school hours that we can keep that hub open. Having said that, the practitioners are almost always in school during the day, but it means it's slightly out of school. It's less intimidating for family or parent workshops or one-to-one meetings with youth justice or one-to-one support for young people that perhaps don't feel that they're quite ready to come into the main school building. Maybe they are school phobic, or it's been a long time since they've been in education. So we have to look at things like that. Cost savings, absolutely. So I think it's understood, and if many of you may be from a mainstream background, if you try to place a young person in AP or PRU, the costs can be prohibitive, certainly take a lot out of the budget. As an example, the DFE will share, and I can share this data as well, that it costs approximately £20,000 to £22,000 a year to keep a young person in even the most straightforward AP, whereas your ORPU in a mainstream school is much lower than that. If we've got 82% reintegration rates, I use that as example. So in that year where 82% of the students reintegrated back into mainstream out of those 96, if those 82% stayed in mainstream rather than come back out for AP, that would save approximately 2 million out of the Doncaster high needs block, which isn't insignificant. So, but it's to me, it's bigger than that, because we could spend all of that money if it made a difference. But for me, it's about turning those young people's lives around, and also by putting that earlier intervention into the home where it's most needed for some of our young people, and quickly, that's worth more than money.
Yeah. And that really links back to what Joe said earlier on about moving into thinking about what needs to happen within the system. Because often, within education, work is so siloed, and therefore budgets are siloed. And what you're saying there is this work needs to be spent much earlier on, much further upstream, in order to prevent these reoccurring cycles. And overall, then there'll be a greater impact and a greater efficiency.
Yeah. And seeing ourselves as a family of schools, one lead family practitioner going into the home to work with a St Wilfrid student, but then actually supporting siblings from 2 other schools. I might not see the financial cost saving of that, but in the system you will. And that'll come down within the borough or the city of Doncaster. And so that means actually what we're able to do is we're able to save on some of that money, which will come back into the system elsewhere.
And this is a question to both of you. We've talked about interventions and things that can be done in settings. What about the challenge when we say, well, I run a school, or at the school in my area serves far more pupils, and it's not possible to do this at scale? Joe, what are your initial thoughts to that sort of challenge? And then Dirk afterwards, please.
Sorry, Dennis, you cut off the second half of that.
Yeah, the challenge of schools saying I've got far too many pupils to be able to take this sort of approach in order to support the pupils that we have because of scale. What do you think to that?
Yeah, so I think the point we'd always make at YF. So actually, in terms of the number of children involved in violence is really small, right? When we share statistics on the sort of prevalence of violence, it can be easy to sort of overstate this. And so I think what we'd always say is just targeting can be really important, right? And thinking about, right, who are your highest need children? Now there are lots of things, and the DFE and MOJ did some really fantastic analysis last year, actually, that I can share in the chat, on where they looked at social care data, education data, and justice data, and which characteristics are then more associated with later involvement in violence and offending. And so, it's the things that we'd expect. So it's being excluded or suspended from school. It's being looked after the child. It's having a child protection plan. However, we also need to be really careful that we're not just really deterministic, because even amongst those children, it's still rare. It is still really rare. And so what we'd always say is, actually, school settings, school, college, and AP settings are good at this. Pastoral teams in those settings are good at this. They understand their children, and they know which children will need additional support. Dirk will know which children need support better than if he gets a spreadsheet up and works out which of those have those risk factors, right? So I think just thinking really carefully about which of those children have the highest needs, and targeting resource accordingly, I think is what we'd advise. But we completely recognise that's tricky, and you're balancing things whilst doing that.
Yeah, anything to add?
Yeah, it's a phrase that comes up quite often around me. You only know what you know. So I didn't know the impact that my APST would have until they started the work they're doing. And one of the first things that the early help coordinator did during the summer holidays, while we were all in sunny, wherever we go on holiday, she did she rag rated all of the young people that were coming in year 7 or due to start the school. So I mentioned, sorry, the therapy dog is now running around in the background. Rag rated all the young people that were due in. And I mentioned the mosaic system, which is available across our borough. And while we were away, she rag rated all those young people. So when I came back in September, on my desk was interesting, Joe says it, a spreadsheet, but it rag rated the risk levels of those young people. And it was something I would never have thought of doing. But again, this is how, we all have early help coordinators within our cities or boroughs. And I think there's a challenge there as a school or a school leader to say, right, during the next month, in August, when I wouldn't like to presume that they're not as busy as during the school day, because we know that school holidays are a challenging time for families. But it's giving them that piece of work and saying, look, can you give me some support? Can you let me know which young people that are coming in my new year 7 that are on your radar, that are likely to need family support, or who's on support already, and at what level? And that really has had a big impact, because what it's meant is we've been able to target some of our most costly interventions at those young people and get them there quicker.
Sorry, Dennis, you're on mute.
Sorry, over to you, Joe.
Sorry. So, I mean, linked to that, I mean, we talk about this in the guidance as well, like the importance of multi-agency collaboration locally, and particularly from a safeguarding perspective. So a lot of those multi-agency arrangements will have systems in place where some of that education data can be fed into it to start assessing need. And I think what Dirk's example has really shown here is that actually, like, just doing things as an island is just way better. And it sounds obvious, right? But and it's something that, it's been said for quite a long time. But really effective multi-agency partnership and co-location in the way in which it's happened in APST is a really fantastic method of doing it. But yeah, ensuring that education settings in particular are leaning into those local safeguarding arrangements is really key. Oh, sorry, Dennis, you're on mute again.
Thank you all for your comments in the chat. And yeah, there's a couple of questions that we'll tie up as we start to bring this conversation to a close. If you've still got a question that you've not had a chance to ask, please do pop it in the chat. Joe, there's a question around excessive use of exclusion rooms. And although it may be only impacting a handful of children, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that sort of practice.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence on this is really limited. Yeah, I wouldn't want to comment from a sort of practice perspective. I think, yeah, I really like what Dirk shared on the reason why they're doing things. And I think that ultimately what this tends to come down to, even though there's a lot of heat in the debate around, how isolation rooms and things like that should work. Actually, the evidence base on all of that is really limited. And so I think it's just about exactly what Dirk was saying, like knowing your context, learning what you can from the evidence, and taking what you can from the relatively limited evidence. I mean, there's good evidence around particular behavior strategies that you can use, but really having a clear theory of change for why you're doing things. And Dirk articulated that really well, right? Like the reason why you set up I don't think you even called them isolation rooms, but the reason why you set up that space in that way is because it suits your needs, it suits the needs of the children in your setting, and clearly you're seeing a read through to different outcomes as a result of it. So yeah, I wouldn't want to artificially say, yeah, there's fantastic evidence for this and fantastic evidence for that when there isn't. And I think in those spaces where there's not, that's where we can learn so much more from really fantastic practice.
Yeah, and there's a great point in the chat as well around that collaboration between primary and secondary. Often that transition point can be a time when institutional knowledge is lost, and therefore secondary schools are kind of sometimes kind of a few steps behind where they might like to be. I heard of some practice recently around trusted adults, and this was a school that took a picture of every student and popped it on the table, and in staff meetings would go through, and teachers and staff members would write their names next to the students they felt they had a positive relationship with. And then the pupils who had none or fewer names next to them, they would be targeted with specific members of staff to build those relationships. And I thought that was just such a great example of practice that could easily be replicated in multiple settings. And yeah, Dirk, someone suggesting there perhaps primary schools could be given the task of starting that information and that regulating process off, and then handing it over to the school that they take on next. What are your thoughts on that, Dirk?
Yeah, so yeah, I agree. And the earlier that you start that work, the better. I mean, we're just doing a pilot. Sounds like we do a lot. And we're just starting a pilot this week, a year 6 to 7 transition pilot, where in the city we've the local authority have identified 8. Doesn't sound a lot, but 8 young people they really think will struggle when they transition to mainstream. Despite lots of additional transition visits, lots of additional work that's going on from the secondary schools. So what we're looking to do is bridge that gap. So we're looking to do some work with that task force team and the wraparound in the 4 to 5 weeks before the summer holiday starts. Give some support over the summer holidays, but also still be there in the first half term as those young people transition to the secondary schools. So by supporting those visits, but actually where we think that they might need some of that wraparound to be able to signpost that early and be able to support it.
Thank you. So as we start to bring this conversation to a close, I'm going to share a feedback form. I have to be honest, this is my very first one of these virtual learning cafes. So I'd really appreciate as much feedback as possible in terms of what worked, what you'd like differently next time, and how we can improve our collaborative working with the sector at large. I want to take a moment to thank both of our contributors. If you know where to find the reaction button on your screen, please do locate it now and just show our appreciation to both Joe and Dirk. Thank you very much, both of you. If you want to keep connected with the YEF, one of the ways you can do that is by subscribing to our newsletter. We do an education-specific one and a general one as well for all of those updates. And if you'd like to connect with us, we'll place our emails in the chat as well. And we'd love to hear from you and hear a bit more about what you do in your context and areas as well. Thank you very much for joining this call, and we look very much forward to seeing you again at some time in the future. Thank you.